Welcome to JJD Thoughts Podcast, the Apex. This is a special episode because it is going to be our first. We're calling it the Origin or Ground Zero. My name is Jan Almasy, so let's back up and talk about how we ended up here. I grew up in a small town here in Canton, Ohio, which is about an hour south of Cleveland for those of you that aren't from the Ohio area. And I learned a lot of lessons from a lot of different people as I was growing up. In high school, I kind of went off track, and I was at a point in my life where I was either going to end up in basically juvenile detention or I was going to get my life together. And through a couple of different experiences with some people, including my grandfather, who I will talk about most likely a lot on this show, joining the military and some other things, I was able to change a lot of momentum, a lot of bad momentum that I had built up. So we'll fast forward, now sitting on coming up on 5 years in the military, graduating with my nursing degree and a psychology minor from Walsh University. This past April, I was awarded the Tower of Excellence Award from Walsh University, which allowed me to give a commencement speech at graduation. I'd like to read a section of that for you now to start off this episode. So to the speech. The apex of my life is my death. I'll say that again. The apex of my life is my death. These are the words of my squadron commander, LtCol Phil Brown, a man of ever-evolving perspectives. The first time I heard him say these words out loud, they resounded with me. Although they may seem a little bit morbid at first, I hope to show you in the short amount of time that I have your attention just how prolific these words are. As a staff sergeant in the Air Force, I am charged with developing and mentoring all new recruits on my installation prior to leaving for basic training. One of my favorite things about this position is being able to interact and learn from people from all different backgrounds, with different life stories, different reasons for joining, and different paths in front of them. Regardless of these backgrounds, regardless of where they came from, and regardless of their perceived personal failures in the past, they are treated as equals, as comrades, as teammates, and as human beings. You are graduating your own form of basic training today. As you sit in these seats, you are achieving a milestone after years of late nights, cram sessions, and most likely some tears. You should be proud. But the apex is the highest point of any given path or object. Imagine if today was your apex. Now, if you'd like to listen to the rest of that speech, you'll be able to find it in the description of the podcast. There's a link to the YouTube video. And today, I have the privilege and the honor to be sitting across the table from the man that inspired the intro line to that speech, Lieutenant-Colonel Phil Brown. So, the man behind the apex, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
So, you spent a lot of time with me editing that speech kind of back and forth, right? I mean, let's just talk about that line, that the apex of my life is my death. Where did that come from?
Actually, it came to me about 20 years ago. I was on a trip. I couldn't tell you where I was headed, but I was on an aircraft. And just when you're flying and looking out the window, you get a different perspective on life. You have a different view of many things. And the word apex stuck out as a high point. And at that time, I had young daughters at home, 2 daughters, and my wife. And I thought, what a wonderful time. Things were going well. And I thought, what if this were my apex? And what does that mean? Does that mean if I say this is my apex, does everything after this point go downhill? Can you have many apexes in life? And so that's when I thought that I said to myself, I want to continue to build on. Build on the positives, build on the negatives. So when you think about that phrase of the apex of life being my death, of course it does sound morbid when you think death. But just think about whether you are thinking about the mortal life or even with the immortal life. It doesn't matter which side you go with. That you do know that you have a finite time here on earth. We do know that it is a definite end of our physical body.
Right.
So it's a choice. And with my faith, I believe one of the things God did give us was free will. That was the greatest gift, to make a choice. And along with this is I made a choice to say everything from even today as I sit here, I'll build upon the successes of today or even the failures of today and improve and try to be better tomorrow. So it's not only a literal statement, it could be figurative in the sense of always going up, but you want to know that at the end of the day, when you look back, you said, I've done everything I wanted to achieve and I gave it my best, no matter when that end will be.
Exactly. And I really agree with the point that you just said about it can be both the successes and the failures, building on both of those. Because I wouldn't have ended up in this chair if I hadn't decided I was going to try to build off of a lot of the failures that had happened in my life in that period between about 14 and 19.
Sure.
And at this point, of course, I still fail every day, but it's not quite to that magnitude, mostly because I had good mentors, people that were willing to take all that energy that I had and point it in the right direction. As long as I was willing to learn from the failures, and that's something that I said later on in the speech that we talked about, as long as you're willing to learn from the failures and dictate what you do moving forward, it wasn't actually a failure.
I think that's a problem we have in our society. We look at the words failure, mistakes. They have such a negative connotation to them. And I have a fellow commander who's a commander down in Little Rock, Arkansas, that actually tells his airmen in his squadron that it's okay to make a mistake. He actually will tell them, I want you to make a mistake. And he does that because he understands it's a training environment they're in. I haven't gone as far to tell my airmen to make a mistake.
Right.
But I do tell them when we do make a mistake, let's learn from it. Let's learn from it. Let's not jump on the individual right away and just start scolding, yelling, and screaming. Let's find out why. What was the mistake? How did we get there? And I think probably one of the biggest things when mistakes happen, even with an individual, especially from a leadership perspective, I take it from the approach, I look inside myself first, especially when someone's under my command or under my authority, and I ask the very basic questions. What did I do? Or what did I not do? Did I not train them properly? Did I not give clear instructions? Did I give too much authority to that individual?
Right.
And when you back up in the process, we find out that, especially with, and I'll say often in times, bad leadership, that's what happens is you blame the member for the mistake when ultimately it falls back on the supervisor, superintendent, the commander, whomever, the director.
And that's been said all across time. I mean, most recently by the book Extreme Ownership that I kind of credit a lot of the mentality that I built here, written by Jocko Willink, says no bad teams, only bad leaders. And then, I mean, all the way back to Napoleon, no bad regiments, only bad colonels, right? So that concept has been present in human nature in general across a very long period of time.
Sure. Well, let's jump back into the apex of life there. In that conversation, understand if you're looking at a graph right now, you could say that maybe your college graduation, it might be the high point of your life right now. So you may be in your early 20s, graduating, and that's a fantastic point. It is a wonderful point. But if you choose that to be your apex, it essentially says everything after that is on the glide slope downward. the idea behind this concept, if I'm using a graphic, it's almost like maybe if you look at a chart of the growth of the Dow Jones Industrial from its inception to present day, clearly the number today is much higher than what it was when it opened more than 100 years ago.
Right.
But along the way, you'll see many dips. You'll see some very sharp dips and then see some sharp rises. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot like our lives. So as I'll look at your journey. You mentioned you had some growth period. We could call it a negative period, but I'll call it a growth period because you learned from it.
Right.
And again, my views of mistakes are such that I really don't consider a mistake unless you continue to make them, the same mistake. But if you've learned from it, that's a growth opportunity. And you did, and here, as you mentioned, 5 years into the military, very successful, college graduate. Things are going the direction you chose them to go. And along the way, you will have some dips in this, but you'll continue to rise. And you may have another dip. The idea is not to have the very deep valleys in this slope up. And the slope, it's not say a 45, 50, 60 degree slope up. It's not, don't think of the slope like that, but just like time. It's always moving forward and you're always improving. And when you get to your final day, you can look back and say, I've given everything I've had.
Yeah, and that slow, just kind of ever-moving timeline progression is kind of a concept that I try to impart, where it's not, very rarely is success or people's definition of success instantaneous. Most of the time, it's over a very long period of time, and it's incremental, consistent, disciplined decisions day in and day out, where if we use extremes, right? Somebody doesn't end up as the president of the United States overnight. That's consistent, purposeful decision, meaningful decision after decision after decision to get there. And most of the time, somebody doesn't end up homeless and addicted to drugs or in prison or on some other negative side of the spectrum overnight. It's decision after decision after decision, whether it's because of factors of where they grew up or where they are. Regardless of that, if we break it down to just the decision,
sure.
At that point, it's just consistency. I mean, and you can choose every day on that timeline if you're going to make a decision that's going to boost that apex just a little bit,
sure,
or you're going to make decisions that's going to make a dip. But like you said, the goal is to avoid making decision after decision after decision to create a valley.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the key to this, the whole idea behind this phrase too, it's not dependent on any of the social values that we have, whether it's socioeconomic, education. It doesn't matter if you have $0 to your name, no education, this applies. And one may ask the question, they would look and maybe say, President of the United States, billionaire, made the highest office, at least in this country,
right?
Compared to maybe a school teacher that has taught for 30, 35 years and produced so many wonderful minds out in the community that benefit thousands and thousands more lives. So success can be seen through so many different lenses.
Exactly.
And if you want to just focus on maybe what's in print, we're missing a point. I'll draw a correlation over to the military side. Both of us are in the military. I've been in for more than 30 years. And a lot of society looks up to us in thanks and high regard for protection of freedoms. And you could really go anywhere if you have any veterans type either shirt on or your ID card or such, and many people thanking you for your service. And it's very kind. Quite often when I give speeches, I make it a point to mention that while this is very much appreciated, it was a choice that we made to serve our country. And I draw the comparison to maybe a mother or a father that couldn't have joined the service, might have not been able for several reasons unknown, but they might have sent one, two, all of their children off to war, to the military. Mm-hmm. And when you take that perspective then, you say, who's the veteran now?
Right.
So here's a mother that sits at home, or a father that sits at home knowing their son or daughter is off on a war front.
Or the military spouses. I mean,
even into the military spouse. That's exactly right. Exactly right. They always have it. I always say they have it harder than the deployer. The deployer is trained. They have the. It's not to say that they're not in an unsafe situation. It's just to say that they do have the training, the specialized equipment, different set of safety parameters in place.
And they're busy. I mean,
and they're busy.
You're doing work consistently, so
they are. But the spouse, the parents, the children back home, that continue day after day without the knowledge and have to worry of that struggle of their loved one's safety. That I've added them to the veteran list. I've had to add them to the veteran list because we need them, and we could not do our job without them. And again, history. You think back to the World War II, the mothers that sent on, their hands were really essentially tied. They can't say no, and just continue to move on. Whether they did, any of the numerous drives they had back to support their troops, and they didn't get a say so if their son or daughter was killed in battle, and a lot of them suffered silently and just had to live with that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of times where I've spent reading. Either because there's books that are collections of letters that military members had sent home, or journal entries and stuff like that. But at the end of a lot of the letters or the journals or those sections in the book, it says this person was killed on D-Day, or this person was killed in this battle. Sure. This was the last letter that their family received. And the sobering thought behind that, where there's such a proud heritage of both, like the families understanding that, especially in World War II, I mean, we're the United States joining to eliminate an evil from the planet and sending those letters back. A lot of the letters, people would think that some of the letters have like fear or a lot of other things, but a lot of the letters that I've read I've come to grips with the fact that I'm probably going to die tomorrow, and I am proud to be able to die in this uniform for this country.
A mindset I think, as society struggle with today to imagine what that would be like.
Exactly. And these are kids. I mean, some of them lied to get into the service at 16, 17 years old. These are 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. Yes. And then I asked people all the time, like, what are you doing at 18, 19, 20? I mean, these guys are on beaches willing to die for their country at that point in time, and we're struggling because our Wi-Fi went out and we can't watch Netflix.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And you know that all this does tie into that apex of life, that idea there. You asked earlier what inspires me, or how this stuff came to mind, and so much comes through reading. I really truly enjoy reading biographies, autobiographies, history. I like to study not only the positives in the way of leadership. I'll also study the bad leaders, the negative side of it too. So you know what not to do, or why did that fail? I definitely don't want to go down that path. One book that I'll recommend to you and also to any of the listeners right now. It's a common one throughout college and in psychology, and that's by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning.
Yes.
Very powerful book.
Very, very powerful book.
It really is. And again, when you think, he addresses so much, and like any other book, you can pull so much, or actually whatever you want out of the book. You can take it out of context and to satisfy your needs. In this case of Viktor Frankl's book, I took the fact that when man was at his lowest, and man in the sense of human, at its lowest form in those camps, that they make a choice. to live, die, move on. And that was his story. And it was a powerful story because we're in, for all intents and purposes here in America, in more of a comfort sense, clearly, as compared to concentration camps. So we are, definitely we could say that.
Very, very clearly, yeah.
And not in a position to say to be in that position Viktor Frankl was. That goes back to free will, making a choice. And of course, in that story, his wife, he would, that gave him hope. That gave him hope too that someday he would see his wife, unbeknownst to him at the time, what her fate had been. But it still gave him hope, something to live for, and which each one of us need to do. And yet, even after the war was over, even after he finds out that his wife was killed, he was still able to move on, and I'll even back up, even after his dignity was taken away, all his humanity, all his notes, everything taken from him, the life as he knew, just stripped down to a basic human life form at best. And he still made the choice afterwards to continue to move. He had no choice but to move forward, but he moved up.
Right.
And he continued with his writings. He took his lesson, a lesson essentially that none of us would have to, hopefully, would never have to go through like he had done. And it has impacted millions and millions of people now to this day. I'll even say as a positive lesson, a positive way to look at life.
Well, and being able to read books like that. One quote, I just pulled it up, that always stuck out for me from that book was humor, and how he talks about humor, even in a concentration camp at that basic, like you said, you're degraded down to a basic human life form at best, at most subhuman. You're treated like you're not even human at that point. And to the book, here's a quote. Quote, "It is well known that humor, more than anything else in human makeup, can afford an aloofness and an ability to rise above any situation, even if only for a few seconds," end quote. And it's that raw, humor, trying to make somebody laugh or finding some positive light in a situation and choosing to see it can make you rise above almost anything.
Sure.
Even if it's just for a few seconds.
Sure. There you used the word choice. You said choosing, but yeah, it's a choice.
Yeah.
Choice. You could do it. I'll make a choice. Do I want to follow you and listen to that?
Right. So let's back up a little bit. Talk about you said that you've spent 30 years in the military.
Absolutely.
Right? So when we first met, you were coming into the squadron as our new commander. I think I was an A1C at the time, I think still. Maybe senior airman. But you were coming in, and I will forever remember your initial roll call when you said that the day that you made staff sergeant was your favorite day.
Well, actually, it was Buck Sergeant back
Buck
then.
Sergeant at
That's
that
right.
point.
That's
So,
right.
but making NCO status was your favorite rank. So why is that something that you point to as a milestone in your military career, but also as something that you look back on with pride and you take that moving forward as an officer at this point?
All right. The simple answer is we as humans, we want to belong. We want to belong. And whether it's to an organization, to a university, we're Buckeyes, we're Christians. It's not saying we like the labels, but it's a belonging. And for me, going through in the military, I know once I was, actually when I put my first stripe on, I was what we called a slick sleeve back then. And so that first stripe, I think they called them mosquito wings.
Yes.
And that was when you were actually called an airman, and that was very rewarding because that was the first step of belonging. I belonged to a larger organization, the United States Air Force. That was very, very empowering to be part of. It didn't say that I was an airman I was equal to every other airman that ever wore the uniform in the history of the Air Force at that point in time, because I was now officially an airman. So that was the first phase, and then Yeah, as you mentioned, when I finally put on the rank of sergeant, that was where I identified. And for us in the military, the NCO ranks, the non-commissioned officer ranks, is where I call it the lifeblood. That's the heart of the workforce. And so to be called sergeant, just it still to this day resonates with me because of who a sergeant is, who an NCO is, and I know what it takes to be an NCO, and I know that that's where the work gets done. The pulse of any organization is in that NCO. So yeah, I believe on that day I did say I've gone through several officer ranks, but it was the one that really meant the most to me was sergeant. So I think I told you guys if you call me sergeant, I'd definitely turn my head, and I still do.
Yep, and that's what I was like. Oh, I can't just call you Sarge, but maybe Colonel Sarge. That'll work better for me. Like you said, the NCO is kind of the lifeblood of that military organization, and in the business world, that's kind of your mid-level managers or some people that have been with your company for a period of time that have learned the ins and outs and can train new people coming up, but they still are in. The biggest thing that I see with the NCO rank, being that I'm in it right now, is we're like a connection between the airmen and the senior NCOs and the officers. We're like a buffer zone. We can take orders, we understand orders and why we need to do them, and impart that on the other troops below that may not have quite as much of an understanding of what the officer is talking about. And the officers generally, do the solid job of communicating down the line and understanding that the NCOs are that lifeblood force in the way that they communicate. In the business world, if like the CEO is talking to the mid-level managers or takes the time to come down and interact with them and say, okay, hey, this is why we're doing what we're doing. This is the purpose behind what we're doing. Giving clear communication down the line can do so much for an organization. Because I've been in parts where, not necessarily militarily, but I've been under a chain of command, quote unquote, that did not communicate. And there was a vision up top, but nobody down below knew what that vision was. So we were walking around in the dark. And then everybody loses motivation. They don't want to work for you. You have to impart like dictatorial leadership styles to get people to do things because there's no connection. You lose that sense of community. So if you had to give a piece of advice to somebody that's in that buffer zone right now, as far as leading troops or learning how to lead troops and stuff like that, what would a piece of advice to somebody in that position, whether it's civilian side as a mid-level manager or a younger NCO, from now looking at it from the top down and then also still having pride in that position and remembering what it was like to be there?
Well, I think I'll start with what you just said there, is remembering what it's like. Don't forget your roots. I always believe before you know where you're going, you have to know where you came from. I didn't make this up. This is commonly heard. You might have heard it before. And that could be whether you study history or even in your organization, you started at ground zero as a green employee. Mm-hmm. So once you reach that mid-level, as we call it, again, I'll jump back to even the Viktor Frankl, back to making a choice. You could say, I'm going to just sit and stagnate here. I really got what I wanted. I'm just going to stay in a follower role. From this point on, I'm good. Leave me alone. You need to understand, though, especially in an aggressive organization, that if you make that choice, that those younger members behind you that are aggressive will not only pass you up, but in a corporate structure might even push you out of the system. Mm-hmm. So the advice is, take every opportunity. Just because you got there, don't rest on your laurels. Do not stop. Add to it education, experience, opportunities, challenges. If they don't exist, look for them. Try to create them. Not to the point that you ruffle any feathers of the management, but when you make these decisions or or try to create opportunities or start asking these questions, you will have to know what the mission or the direction is of the organization, of the CEO, of the commander. Where are we headed?
Clear intent.
And military is great because we always have a plan, and whether it's a battle plan, and you know the end game. What are we trying to reach? What is the end that we want to get to? Think of the Persian Gulf War. I know there was a lot of emotions high back then. Why didn't we go in and take Saddam Hussein? Well, because the president's order was to liberate Kuwait. And when we liberated Kuwait, we did that and protected that country from Iraq re-entering into Kuwait. That's what we said our mission was. We completed our mission. We didn't have that follow-on mission to say, remove Saddam Hussein from the leadership of his country.
Right.
So that was a clear vision, a very clear and concise vision. And in your organization, if there's another thing I would tell you as a mid-level is many times don't make assumptions either. Don't make assumptions that just because your leaders are there, just because they have many years in the organization, maybe even have a letter designation in front or behind their name, whether it's CPA or doctor in front, that they have all the answers and know it all. You're coming in with a new set of eyes. We were talking before this podcast started. I've done recording in studios before, but this is totally new for me, a podcast. Right. So this is the new generation's technology. This is a new generation's venue. This is that kind of idea that your generation's going to be selling to us, saying, here's how to mass communicate. And we're all scratching our heads saying, I don't get it. How are you going to give me a little, I can't even see zeros and ones, and you're going to give me this product and say it's mass communication.
Right.
And you're laughing saying, how? You don't get this.
You're still thinking about the actual cutting and pasting.
Cutting and pasting, that's right. Film or whatever it is.
Right.
And that's why I said, don't assume that we know everything. Don't assume we have all the answers. Don't be afraid to professionally and to challenge. Or there's always a proper way to question or
I
bring
think
those
is
ideas.
the key right there.
Oh, sure.
Professionally, properly. I mean, you can't just. And this is something I've talked to my aunt about. This. My aunt is she's been with the company for like 30 years. She's high up. And she's an awesome lady. I might be a little bit biased because she's my aunt, but she talks all the time about these kids. I mean, she's in her 50s, I think. So these kids coming in that are in their 20s that have bachelor's degrees and everything else that are coming up to her being like, okay, you're doing this, this, and this wrong, and this process is wrong. We can do this better, and just aggressively coming up and being like, you're wrong, which is not the professional, not the proper way to do that at all. I think there's been times where I've had like a person above me that is doing something that I was like, oh, we could probably improve that. But instead of going up and saying, hey, you're wrong, it's, hey, ma'am, or hey, sir, so I see like we're doing this process and everything. I have a couple of ideas, but I really need your help to kind of like walk me through this because I'm not really sure 100% about what the process is, but I have some of these ideas. I'd like for you to take a look at them with me because I really need your help. And you can tell them, hey, I really need your help with this. And it makes them like, oh, this person's coming up to me. Like they need my help with something. I'm going to try to show them. I mean, they may tell you to just go away because they're busy, but that's way better. And pulling them in as a teacher and then kind of planting your seed of an idea in their head. And they're like, oh, and then even if they take credit for it, for the idea, at least the process got better. And at some point, upper level leaders are going to see, hey, this airman is taking, or this new employee is taking initiative and pulling other people in, maybe giving some ideas and everything like that. And it may not come right away. You have to be patient with it, but at least processes are getting improved. The company's running smoother. And as the company begins to improve those processes and stuff down the line, people are going to get recognized and you'll be able to move up the chain. And you'll learn from those upper level leaders rather than just shutting them down, making them feel insulted. And now there's a anti-relationship built there where they're not going to want to help you move forward.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you want to work to your advantage. One thing I would say is at the college level, or I don't want to say you're going to learn this at the first few stages, the green portion of your career, but definitely at your mid-level, you're going to be discussing things, situational management, situational leadership, and there's tons of books out there on this stuff. Generally, when we talk situational leadership and situational management, we often think down or behind us. Who am I managing? Who am I leading? Take that and flip it on in and saying, what style does my manager use? What style does my leader use or does not use? One book that they often give us in the military to read assigned is Sun Tzu, The Art of War, common book. Challenge you to read that also. This is 2,000-year-old writing, very applicable not only in war but also in life.
2,000 years later.
Exactly.
It's almost like those principles don't change.
Well,
right?
but yeah, so there's so much truth though. I was reading something the other day that the author was stating that essentially there's not a whole lot of new that we're doing today, not new things to be discovered. We'll find some things, but a lot of it's just repackaging or a morphed version of what we've discovered. So even with the elements, we're finding more, digging a little bit deeper, and adding some of some onto our chemical chart. Of course, my daughter, who's a chemistry professor, probably would kill me listening to me talk about this right now. But
talk about the periodic table.
Yeah, sure, more will be found. But as for ideas, I think a lot of them are regenerated or repackaged, remarketed.
Mm-hmm. Like reapplied to the current time.
Reapplied, yeah. Exactly. So we could take, there's people writing, but in different forms, what Sun Tzu said a couple thousand years ago. So it's not that we're having new ideas, it's just how we're saying it and how we're applying it. We talk about, we've never seen X happen. You were talking about how to approach your senior managers. How many times have you heard a manager or a boss saying, "Well, that's we've always done it that way." Mm-hmm. And as you were talking, I was thinking of, what are you millennials pushing us on? A good example is the 40-hour work week. And someone may say, "Well, we've always done that." Well, we know that's not true. We've not always had a 40-hour work week. Even in the 1800s and beyond that, you worked till the job was done.
Right.
And
try to tell a farmer that he has a 40-hour work week.
That's exactly right.
And see what happens.
That's right. The clock seems to be a problem at times here. But what your generation is pushing is saying, give me the task. Quit focusing on the time. Give me the task. Hold me accountable for a task to accomplish. If you give me a task that only takes an hour to do, but because your 40-hour work week schedule says I have to be here 8 hours or 9 hours, now I'm going to take an hour-long project and be real inefficient with it and drag it out for 7 hours I didn't need to. Mm-hmm. And so while you're challenging management leadership on something as simple as that, management's pushing back and saying, why are you guys being so lazy and sitting around or wanting to rush out of here? And when they don't have an answer, one of the first things they'll tell you is find something to do to keep yourself busy. Well, again, inefficient answer, not the right answer. So your generation is pushing us and saying, we need to rethink this. How do you work this? Change that variable. Why are you so focused on that variable? And years back, I even wrote a chapter in a book I was working on. It's Time Without Time. And when you think about how dependent we are on time, and it's been about 15 years since I've worn a watch. Why? Because there's clocks all around the place. But before we had watches and clocks, we worked along with sun's up, or till the job's done. Mm-hmm. You weren't dependent on a clock. And it's funny how now your generation is pushing it so much that time is important, but you want your time. Let you decide what to do with it. Give me a job, I'll do it, and pay me for my job. But quit focusing on that time variable.
Right.
So it's work without time. And that's just one of many ideas that I'm watching your generation push. And it's fascinating to watch, but we're just so stuck in this paradigm because we said you have to have some type of structure. And so we create a 40-hour work week, whether we use all 40 hours or not. And if we use more, we'll pay overtime. Okay, fine. But in reality, is that the best model?
Right.
And it's okay to question it, come up with a solution, make it work. You've seen some of the things I've tried to do in the squadron. I've seen other companies do that where, yes, you have a very clear chain of command. I was in a conversation the other day, and the discussion was about a company, a very successful company, that the employees were so empowered in that company that's why the efficiency was there. And low overhead, but they were in the billion-dollar range of revenue. And then when the market crashed back in the early 2000s, well, it might have been 2008 that this one happened, 7-8 time frame. It came down to, the company took a 30% hit, and the CEO knew they had to make cuts. So it was decided across the board equally that they would all take a period of time off at their, let's say, 4 weeks. Over that 1 year, unpaid leave. So we could save the company, and everybody saves it. Every job is saved instead of laying off maybe your lowest workers. Everybody was put on an equal plane then. And in some cases where those that could give a little bit more, that might have been maybe well off, had a little bit more money. They could take 5 weeks or 6 weeks unpaid, where someone else that might be a single parent that needed the money, maybe they only had to take 2 weeks.
Right.
And that worked in that organization. And that is, it's a wonderful model if you can make that work. And I think in any organization, there's a beauty of our military because of its organizational structure, and I do believe strongly in the organizational structure. But there's at times where you could take that hierarchy that we use, almost a corporate ladder or corporate ladder model, and put it horizontally.
And you do that with a lot of different things. And one thing that I really like, and I've heard a couple of different people across my military career say this, and in my civilian jobs. Some of the civilian bosses that I've had that have been the best to work for are the ones that say, if I'm doing something, the position doesn't matter. Or like you say, the rank comes off. You should be holding me accountable just as much as I'm holding you accountable for things.
Right. Doing the right thing is independent of any rank, any dollar figure.
Exactly.
Yeah. So especially when it comes time for ideas. So you look at the academic environment. Sure, you have a dean or a president of the university, and that's a good comparison to the military, where you have the commander or the general, you may say, and think the buck stops there. But does it? Should it? What about that young member that comes in? There might be a young prodigy that comes in. I'm listening. Absolutely. And I think that's probably the beautiful part of, in my position right now, instead of saying, hey, I'm that old guy in the organization, is to say I have a different perspective. And I'm better off when I do look at many of the young ideas coming in and saying, how are you going to challenge me? I want to hire those. I want those people that will challenge me, not just to always salute wisely and say, I'll do whatever you say. And that's almost scary to a point. There's rare times where, yes, you'll have to follow that command. But on most of the day-to-day projects items we work on, great ideas come from the floor. Great ideas. And that goes back to what I said, is take it, turn it on in. But think about even the President of the United States. I call it a horizontal plane theory. So if you take a tabletop, think about it like that. And President of the United States, in our eyes, we could say he's at that top of that corporate ladder, top position, representing the United States. But what about the cook in the White House? He's just a cook, right?
Or is he? Right.
I guarantee that president is not going to have a good day if he does not have food, a meal to eat, or even a meal to come back to. It's no different than in the Air Force. We often talk about that in the Air Force, flying is our mission. So we generally put the pilots at that level of, there's your apex of jobs.
Right.
But again, if it weren't for, let's say, our members in our finance office that take care of, to make sure the individual's paid, so his or her family back home, the pilot's family back home, is not having to worry about that, or make sure our individuals that take care of the lodging, that when the aircrew gets to its destination, that they have a place to stay. They have a meal or have food on the aircraft that's provided by that young airman.
Exactly.
So all of a sudden, yes, there's the mission, but then when you turn it on end like that, you say there's an interdependency. So that's why I take that horizontal approach and say we're just different points, and there has to be a dependency on each other.
And in all the interconnectedness. And so I kind of unwittingly, so for the listeners, I'm what we call the NCOIC, which stands for the Non-Commissioned Officer in Charge of a program that we have on our installation called Student Flight. And basically what I do, I've been in charge of the program for about 1.5 years now. And before that, I spent about 6 months kind of shadowing, trying to figure out all the inner workings. But we take new recruits that haven't gone to basic training yet and teach them basic rank, common courtesies, the Airman's Creed, the Air Force song, and all of the bare bones things when it comes to just communicating with each other in the military. But then something that I added on top of that was basic leadership concepts, conflict resolution, how to understand your personality type versus another person's personality type, and interacting with people and forming that sense of brother and sisterhood in that uniform. But something that I do that I guess is your horizontal plane theory, now that I'm thinking about it, is I try to tell them you're going to be coming into this organization as either a slick sleeve, 1 stripe, 2 stripe, and that's the max. I mean, you're going to max come in at an E3, right? But you're still the bottom of the totem pole, quote unquote, right? But what I tell them is you're not really the bottom of the totem pole. I was like, you might look at it like that because you look at a staff sergeant or a master sergeant or a captain or a lieutenant colonel, and you're like, oh my gosh, they've been on this base for 20 plus years. I'm walking around and I'm saluting everybody, and I'm still on edge around sergeants because I just got back from basic and they've been screaming at me for the last however many weeks. But what I tell them is when you get to your shop, or even in student flight, someone asks you to sweep a floor. And you're like, man, I just went through, I don't know, what is it, 7 weeks now, 7, 8 weeks down at Texas to put on this uniform. I was like, I'm going to come back. I'm tired of sweeping floors. I just swept floors for 7 weeks and had a drill instructor tell me that I didn't do it good enough. And now you're telling me that I have to sweep a floor when I come back? But what I tell him is, I was like, you don't understand how integral of a piece you are right now. I was like, you're coming back, and yes, you might be sweeping a floor, but while you were gone, that was a staff sergeant's job who's fully qualified on working on the plane, and now he can pick up a wrench and go do his job right now. So without you cleaning that area to give them a safe environment to work in and to free up that other person to go work on the plane, aircrafts don't get off the runway. And it's all connected.
It's all connected. From
the bottom all the way up to the top on that horizontal plane.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's something that we do on military bases that have aircraft on what we call a ramp, and they do what they call a FOD walk, FOD, foreign object debris. And if you've never seen one done before, it's just start on one end in a big long line, and you are walking along this ramp from one end to the next. Think of it like a football field, marching down the field, looking on the ground, picking up every pebble, any minute little thing. You're cleaning up that. You could do it with, you think, well, wouldn't a broom work? Wouldn't that be easier? But even brooms leave things behind. So you're trusting the human instinct to do that. And you could say, wow, that's one of the lowest forms of work that you have possible.
I see people cringe when that comes over the announcements.
Exactly right. But when you think about one of the most critical jobs and how important that is I'm sitting on one of those aircraft ready to taxi out for takeoff. We could say, wow, it's because of the pilot. And then we could also say, well, no, it's because of the maintainers. They do a great job on this aircraft. All true. But what about those individuals that made sure that there's nothing that can get sucked up in the engine that could break one of the turbines off?
And then all that work that the maintenance just did
And then
is
it's
for
just
nothing.
the trickle down that could cost lives.
Right.
So something as what we may look at as a simple, meaningless task has a part that ultimately can be as important as flying that aircraft, paying a bill, fighting a fire, securing the base, all those things. There's a blind trust and a dependency we have amongst each other out there. That's the greatest thing that I see, at least being in the military there. You come through the gate and you might see a individual with one stripe, no stripes, two stripes. Yet they're providing that first line of defense so I can come inside that gate, do my job without fear of harassment, being attacked, the scary things that are happening in society today. That's
Right.
pretty important. That's very important.
And I can relate that back to nursing. I mean, and I think that one of the reasons why I like nursing is because there is still almost a militaristic hierarchical structure in medicine. You have like your physicians, like your officers, and then your nurses are kind of your NCOs and STNAs and nurse aides or your airmen. I was just thinking about this the other day about how I was like, man, why am I so attracted to the structure of nursing? And I was like, oh, it's because it's kind of militaristic. But it works most of the time because that communication is able to happen where, okay, the nurses, we can't get our jobs done if the aides don't do some of their work. And the aides have trouble doing some of their jobs if the nurses don't do their jobs. And we can't give patients medication if the physicians don't write prescriptions. And it's all of this interconnectedness where if one piece starts to fall apart, it can turn your entire day into a crap show.
Well, exactly. Not only turn your workday into a crap show, but it could be the difference of life or death.
Right.
So
both
a surgeon
military
that's
and nursing.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
Dealing with people's lives in one of those most critical points.
That's right.
Where they're at, where one slip up, and that's kind of like the pressure that people feel working in medicine, where it's just, I gotta really make sure I'm on it.
So a common phrase that I'm sure you use in your field that we do in the military is that attention to detail. You can't. It's a lot of people think it's overused, but it's one that I still use to this day because it is. It's practical. It applies. It is right. Even in the smallest things that you miss, there could be some very serious consequences.
Right. Or the smallest jobs.
That's right.
In the very smallest, my grandpa growing up and always told me, and my dad too, this was a huge thing when we were growing up, was you use the right tools for the right job. Like, don't try to use a flathead screwdriver if it's a Phillips. I mean, just go get a Phillips and take it out. But also he was like, I don't care if it's you're cleaning the barn, you're washing a cup, you're doing the dishes for your mom, you're wiping off the kitchen table, or eventually now you're pumping life-saving medication into a person. You do it right and pay attention to all the details. One time I swept out the barn and I had somewhere to go. I think I wanted to go over to a friend's house or something. I was a little kid. I was in 4-H at the time. We had like hogs and goats and stuff in the barn. And I swept it out kind of just I half-assed it basically and just wanted to get out of there, right? I didn't end up going to the friend's house because they went out and inspected it and looked at it and was like, this is crap. Like, what did you think you were going to just sweep it out and then leave? What? No. So I had to stay and went back and had to clean up the rest of that job. But that's always stuck with me where it's just like, it's always better to just do it right, get it done, and then you can move on with the rest of your day. And at that point, you have more freedom because the job is done. And if I would have done it right the first time, I might have been a couple minutes late to my buddy's house, but I would have been at my friend's house, right? And just in life in general, if you take that little bit of extra time, that little extra attention to detail, that little extra bit of elbow grease put into a job, it can impress a professor. It could be the difference between a B or an A in school. It can be the difference between a promotion. It can just those accumulations over time really start to add up.
Which we just talked about 15, 20 minutes ago of allowing that mistake to happen. And because you rushed through something, there was a consequence, and you learned from it. Mm-hmm. And if you choose to continue to do that, there's consequences.
And I would much rather learn that lesson from not cleaning the barn than from a patient dying.
Sure.
Right? Or
That's
like
exactly
in
right.
military and training, when you're running through drills and you're doing stuff, you'd much rather have it happen at home, at a training camp and on a wing flyaway or something like that, when somebody's gas mask doesn't seal or something like that, and learn from that, than actually be surrounded by sarin gas and have something go bad.
That's right.
That's when you can't make mistakes.
That's right.
But you have to do the preparation to get to the point where you're confident enough that you don't make mistakes in that environment.
Yes. Yes. And I think the more critical we get, especially when life is dependent on it, whether it's in your job when you are actually, like you said, pumping life-saving blood, or that pilot that is about to take a whole crew of passengers up in a plane, very checklist driven. Very checklist driven. That they actually will use a checklist, so they're not missing a step. Yeah, it doesn't mean that they don't trust their memory, but you don't want to take a second. You don't get a second chance sometimes on that.
Not at all.
So checklist driven, and most hospitals have in place those checks and balances to double check, triple check, and that's important. That's very important. And the more critical it is, they're not going to have maybe a double or triple check on did the hallway get mopped, but when it came time for someone's safety or their life or the proper medication, is this the right medication, the right dosage, for the right job, for the right patient, all that. There's or before a surgery is performed, do we have the right person,
the right limb that we're trying to amputate,
the right side of the body,
yeah.
the right, exactly right, and and so this is cross-checked numerous times before we even get into that.
And mistakes still happen.
And mistakes still happen.
And that's where it's like, okay,
mistakes still
you
happen.
have to make sure that you're adhering to them, but also accept the fact that human nature is human nature at some point. There's going to be slip-ups, and when they are, you have to address them and move forward. But like you said at the almost the very beginning of the podcast, it's okay. Instead of scolding the person right off the bat for how we got there, yes, there may be disciplinary action that's needed, but
follow on.
Let's go back. How did we get here? What were the gaps? What happened? Because if you just scold the person, discipline them, and then move forward, all of those gaps are unaddressed, and it leaves the door open for that same exact situation to happen again in the future.
That's right. That's right.
So you talked about your horizontal plane theory, right? There's one other theory that I wanted to address with you while you were here, and that's your invisible leader.
Oh, okay.
Theory.
Yeah, interestingly enough, we had I took my leadership team up for a 2-day retreat to do strategic planning the other day, and the captain, Tim Gribble, who set up the retreat, was able to bring in a guest speaker, retired Lieutenant General, 3-star General Lauren Reno. And his book is you can find it on Amazon, on the web. Wonderful leadership book, great read. He was a former Air Force C-130 navigator. And he even posed that question about, very similar to what I said. And it was really funny that, because Captain Gribble and I have had that conversation in the past, because I remember at times I had challenged the younger officers. I said, can you lead from the rear? That was really what spawned that thought. Can you lead from the rear? And he says, absolutely not. You have to lead from the front. Lead from the front. There's another book out there called Leading from the Front.
Well, there's a lot of principles about being that person leading the pack. Yeah.
Sure. And again, that's not a one size fits all either. I mean, there are times when you have to lead from the front. But he had brought up, and his analogy was talking about leading from the back seat. And he took it from that position of a navigator on an aircraft, that you have a pilot and a co-pilot. And in the aircraft, it's the individual that sits in the left seat, the driver's seat. That is the commander of the aircraft. That is the pilot. That's who makes the final decision. Yet, even though he's the navigator, which sits behind the pilot, there's many times where that navigator may say, hey, did we remember to do this? Did we think of this? And it's not that he's He's trumping that commander or that pilot, but it is part of leading from the back seat. And there is a time where it's okay, it's necessary, and it does parallel that invisible leadership or omnipresent leadership. I think of someone, and very simple definition there is Abraham Lincoln. Clearly is not here, but we follow many of his principles to this day, like we do with many leaders that have passed on. So I don't, I'm not at the base every day. Our commander's not at the base every day. But does that mean we don't follow his or her vision or guidance or commands that they've given? So that's that. You don't always have to be there. And if it's the right answer, the right decision, it's almost like your moral compass. You don't have to have a physical compass. Clearly, that's not what we're talking about. It's just that knowledge to do what's right. It's that invisible leadership. When you lead correctly, the goal should be that the subordinates, or even in some cases the superiors, take on that wisdom and carry it with them. They don't have to keep you there, standing in the front, looking at you all the time to say, I'm doing it because I see you there.
Right.
It's because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and it may start out like that. You have to start out sometimes being at the front and being very visible and everything like that. Because, I mean, that's kind of, when you first came into the squadron, you were very visible. I mean, at the front, constantly giving talks, interacting with people and everything like that. But at this point, the squadron is very self-running and adhering to a lot of the principles and stuff like that. And most of the time, you can be found, I mean, you are able to detach now and kind of watch and pick up on those ideas and all that other kind of stuff because the groundwork has been laid.
Sure, that's your forming. When we talk about forming, norming, and such, that's your early stages of the development there. And yeah, if from that very beginning, my first day in, if you saw me just at that initial roll call and then you didn't see me for another 3 months, what kind of leader do you think you're going to have? An involved leader or someone that's, you might say, oh, he's just an officer, he gets away with that kind of stuff. We don't need to see them. Or do you want to be involved, and if you do really have a plan or a vision, that you're there for it. And it does take more work up front. I believe in investing up front. It's especially in leadership. And I draw the parallel over to the medical side. You'd rather practice preventive medicine so you don't have to work harder on the other end of dealing with a problem. So whether it's diabetes, whether there's some things that we can do preventive medicine on, preventive maintenance on, even education, health. There's so many things, and leadership is the same thing. Leadership applies there, completely applies there. So to this day, I have my leaders that have mentored me. Some are alive still. Many have passed, and I still follow their principles. They're very good life principles. They're not only work principles, but life principles. There's some good, some bad, some apply, some don't. That's fine. But for the most part, they give great advice. And it's not always what is said from their mouth, but through their actions, what they've shown you. You can see the results. How do you see the results? Is how their subordinates respond. Those are quite often, that's where you see the results of leadership.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So to put a cap on everything and kind of encompass some stuff. I'm just going to give you the floor. Okay, so if there's somebody out there that's struggling with their apex, right? They believe that they've reached this peak in their life, or that they may have, they're approaching it and they're not sure where to go moving forward, or they're on the downhill slope, whatever situation that person's in. What kind of advice would you give to a person that is in a situation where they feel that they've reached their peak and they're unsure of what to do moving forward?
Well, when you reach that, and there could be a plethora of reasons why they've or thought that they reached their peak. Anything from mental illness, it could be a loss of a job, it could be a tragedy, a death. Just start with the basics. Start with the givens. One is time. Time will continue to move forward. So with that, take that first physical step. Put one foot in front of the other. Or if you're laying down, get up. Just try that. Start with instead of trying to think of an NFL team, you can't win the Super Bowl on day one. You have to actually put the team together. You have to start somewhere. This 3-star general I mentioned, when he was talking with us, he talked about Coach Wooden from UCLA. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things that he taught his team, now this is one of the greatest college coaches that we've had, taught them how to put on their socks. They didn't teach them how to dribble the ball, shoot, or anything like that. Taught them how to put on their socks. Sometimes it's the very simple things that you start with. So I believe in goal setting. So when you think that you've reached that point or your apex, write down your goals. Yeah, a close friend of mine, retired General Rich Green, he was a big believer in that. Write down your goals or they won't happen, he would always tell me.
Right.
And so you'll always have it there as a reminder. It doesn't mean you fail when you don't achieve it, but it gives you something to work forward to, and you're moving towards that. But don't set an unrealistic goal. Don't say, I'm going to win the Super Bowl tomorrow, and I don't even play football now. Make it a realistic goal. Make it that maybe you live a mile from town. Say, I'm going to walk to town. Or maybe I'm going to walk to the end of my driveway. Or maybe I'm just going to walk to the front door. It could be something as simple, especially when it comes time for exercising. It could be, even if it were a relationship issue with a family member that you haven't seen in a while. How do you start? Well, maybe it starts with a letter or maybe a phone call before you go to the visit and moving in with them. Mm-hmm. So it's the term baby steps, so often used. Apply it here. Apply it there, but always set that next goal. And if you're always reaching and always striving, that will keep that always moving up, that apex, and keep pushing that apex level up. If I told you about my daughters, and when this concept came to my mind, and because I thought it was a glorious time in life, I still do. It's wonderful. I loved the girls when they were young. My wife and I had a wonderful time. We've always traveled, and I know when my oldest daughter graduated high school, moved out. That was one of the toughest times of my life, and I thought. So we talked about those ebbs and flows. If I had made that apex early on, that moment when this came to my mind, I would have been going downhill. And that was one of those dips I talk about. Mm-hmm. But even with dips comes opportunity. And she was an adult, and I could be part of that life. And I still had one at home yet that was still starting high school. And I still had my wife. And we still had opportunities. And so this has been 10, 15 years now have gone by. And so I have a new apex, and it may be just something as simple as my wife and I look forward every night going for a walk around the reservoir with the dogs. And it's just our time. There's nobody around. It's quiet. You have nature. You can smell flowers, the breeze on your face, see birds that you haven't seen in a while. An eagle will fly by every now and then. And sometimes it's real quiet, but it's our time. And that's an apex. That's a new apex. And it doesn't mean it's better. It's not about better. It's just saying, life is good. I'm continuing to add to the beauty of life. And I'm looking for that next step. And another new apex is coming up. My oldest daughter, we're having our first grandchild this fall. So there's always going to be new apexes depending on how you want to look on it in life.
Agreed.
But if you don't think you have those apexes, start writing down ones. Say you want to be part of something. Even to make a difference in someone's life, doing a chore for someone. That may be the new apex. It makes you feel good. Doesn't always have to cost you anything to do it. Just helping. Wonderful. Even a wave, a hello, a thank you. Positive. All those create new apexes. And that's about just taking that life trajectory to your last breath.
Amen to that. So to end the podcast, I read the beginning of the speech that Colonel Brown played a big part in at the beginning of the podcast. And the very last page, I think, is a perfect way to wrap up this first episode. So, to the speech. As we surrender today to the past and begin our futures, remember that this is only the first step. What you do moving forward is what will change the world. If you find something you are passionate about, Monday will be your favorite day of the week. Be proud of who you are and your unique abilities to positively affect everyone around you. Create a legacy that will continue to impact the world long after you have left it behind. Dream big, control what you can, never stop learning, and leave the rest up to God. You should only reach your apex when your body returns to the dust and your soul flies high above the mountains. I want you to close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Think of a time when you thought there was no chance that you would be sitting exactly where you are, right now, in this moment. When the times seem the darkest, when you feel hopeless and the world feels so empty that you are on the brink of giving up. Faith, hope, and love will radiate like suns in the deepest abysses. Now open your eyes. You are opening the next chapter in the journey towards your apex. Congratulations and good luck. And cut.